because it stimulates some kind of sensory neuron, which then stimulate a motor neuron, somatic motor neuron, to activate your skeletal muscle for reaction. Okay? Whereas the autonomic reflex, we're talking about the pupillary light reflex. That's the primary autonomic reflex that we talked about in the class. Right? So hopefully you guys recall that from once upon a time. We drew some of that particular stuff on the board. So, okay, now for the motor pathway, this is a pathway dedicated to controlling or stimulating or relaying a motor output to control your skeletal muscle activities. Okay? For this particular pathway, let's say if you want to send out some kind of motor information, it starts with a neuron located in this area of the brain that controls motor activity. What is that area of the brain that controls motor activity? What's it? Parietal is a lobe, motor is a function. So which one is it? Can't have both. So what is the functional cortex that controls motor activity called? The primary motor cortex. Okay. Where is the primary motor cortex located? Which gyrus? The precentral gyrus. Which lobe of the brain does it belong to? The frontal lobe. Okay? All right, so just keep that in mind. I just gave you 3 questions right there. Potentially, I can ask you those 3 questions on the exam, and you still have to be able to answer it correctly. Anyhow, so that here would be your primary motor cortex. Okay? This neuron originates there. The axon moves down along all this area, all the way down on the same side as it moves down this area of what we call the medulla. Medulla oblongata. Okay? As it moves down the medulla oblongata, once it reaches this portion here, this is called the pyramids. Of the medulla. So this particular area here and on the other side. So essentially, once this axon reaches the pyramid, it will decussate over to the other side. Okay? It changes over to the other side, and this axon continues to run down on the lateral side of the spinal cord until it reaches a segment of the spinal cord and it enters the ventral gray horn of the spinal cord. Dorsal gray horn, lateral gray horn, ventral gray horn. Okay? So the ventral gray horn of the spinal cord, that's where it synapse. Once it reaches there, it will synapse with a what the? What happened to that one? Probably got angry. So once it reaches there, it's gonna synapse with another neuron, and this neuron will exit through the ventral area of the spinal cord and project to some kind of skeletal muscle. Okay? So then this is your somatic motor neuron. Now, in order for us to name these 2 neurons in this pathways, this neuron that's exclusively found within the central nervous system basically starts from the primary motor cortex, traverse all the way down through the medulla oblongata, all the way down into the spinal cord, and finally jumping into the ventral gray horn. We call this one the upper motor neuron. Okay? And the neuron that is found in the ventral gray horn, whose axon exits the spinal cord to stimulate the skeletal muscle, we call this the lower motor neuron. Okay? So there's only 2 neurons in a series when it comes to the motor pathway. Now this motor pathway, the axon here follows the tract along the spinal cord on the lateral side. So this tract is referred to as the lateral, and because this neuron starts from the cortex down to the spinal cord, cortico-spinal tract. Okay? So the lateral coracospinal tract, which relays information about motor activities to stimulate the lower motor neurons so that it can stimulate your skeletal muscle, is responsible for 80% of all the motor pathways that is in your body. The other 10 to 20% basically follows what we call the anterior coracospinal tract, which you guys don't really need to know. So know the majority, which is that one. Any questions? All right, that takes care of that. Let's move into what we call the reflexes, okay? Now, in order for you to initiate reflexes and stuff like that, or initiate some kind of movement, you have to also detect certain type of movement imposed onto your muscle itself. So therefore, the receptors responsible for the detection of the muscle activity are known as your proprioceptors, okay? And the sensation of that is called proprioception. So proprioception is essentially the sensation of how your extremities is moving in space in relation to your body. So if I do this, I don't have to look at it, and I know I'm doing this. If I throw a ball up, I don't have to look where the ball lands, I can still catch that ball. That's proprioception. Okay, so go home and test that, right? Throw a ball up and don't look at the ball and just try to figure out where it's gonna land based on the trajectory of that ball and then catch it. If you don't catch the ball, it's all right. It's not a big deal. It's not like you don't have any proprioception. You just really had bad perception of where that ball should be, right? You just basically maybe just have that bad kind of perception inside your mind, okay? But at least if you can touch the ball, feel the ball before you grab it, then at least you know your proprioception is still intact to a certain extent. Okay, now in the muscle, in order for the muscle or in order for your body to detect these proprioception, there are two proprioceptors built into the muscle itself. There's a combination of structures that basically forms this apparatus called the muscle spindle apparatus. And the muscle spindle apparatus is essentially located within the muscle structure. So it's a spindle fiber, so a spindle shape, so it's tapered from one end to the other end, right? Located right next to the tendons, but not on the tendon itself, located within these contractile cells of the skeletal muscle, right? And of course they have different fibers. We're not gonna really account for what those fibers are. Now these structures here have sensory fibers that wrap around them. Okay, so the muscle spindle apparatus is this whole contraption here. Okay, it's made up of the muscle spindle fibers and also the spiral fibers itself, which you guys don't need to separate them out. Just know them collectively as the muscle spindle apparatus. The muscle spindle apparatus is responsible for the detection. Oops. So it detects stretching of the muscle. Okay? Stretch of muscle. So if the muscle stretches, the muscle spindle apparatus detects that. On the other hand, the Golgi tendon organs are these particular structures that are built into or is located within the tendons themselves. So those guys within the tendons of the muscle, we call the muscle tendon organ. Muscle tendon organ, the Golgi tendon organ. Please don't confuse that with the Golgi apparatus. It is named after the same guy who found the Golgi apparatus and the Golgi tendon organs, right? So therefore, it's basically named after that. And it could be, I don't know, I may have made that up. The whole point is don't confuse the Golgi tendon organ with the Golgi apparatus. That's all. Who knows if there's an actual Dr. Golgi or not? I don't know. All right. So for the Golgi tendon organ, they are responsible for the detection, what we call tension, that's applied to the muscle organs. Okay? So one detects stretch, the other one detects tension. Okay? Very important because you obviously have stretching of the muscle and tension applied to the muscle. All right, now as far as reflexes go, there's two basic type of reflexes that you guys need to know. The first one is called a monosynaptic reflex. So this is going to be the primary example of a monosynaptic reflex. Now, when you look at the name of this particular reflex, it tells you there's only one synapse that occurs. Okay? So therefore, let's say if this muscle becomes stretched, how do you stretch this particular muscle? Imagine this is your patella tendon, this is the patella bone, this is the quadricep muscle. How would you stretch this out? What did you guys do to stretch out that particular tendon? You hit it with the reflex hammer. That's what you guys did, right? Just bang the crap out of each other, trying to elicit that kind of, reaction that's going on. So basically, you strike this tendon with a reflex hammer, and when you strike this tendon, it causes this muscle to stretch. So
that example, since it's a knee joint, if you bend the knee, that's not stretching.
what do you mean?
If you bend the knee, if you bend your knee.
Bend the knee like this?
Yeah.
Not necessarily, because you are consciously doing that. To a certain extent, you can feel it going. Yes, you're stretching the muscle, but it's not an immediate, right? For this, when you strike that patella tendon, it's an excessive stretch. So that's why it's not something that you're consciously doing. And that's the reason why you're not supposed to be looking at your patella tendon when it's being struck, right? Okay, otherwise, you can override that particular sensation. All right, so when you strike that patella tendon, it causes this immediate stretch in the muscle. The muscle spindle apparatus can detect this and therefore relay this information through this nerve. The sensory nerve, so let's label this. So sensory neuron relays this information all the way into the spinal cord, right? And this sensory neuron will basically project all the way into the ventrograde horn of that spinal cord, where it will synapse directly onto a motor nerve. And that motor nerve projects all the way back to the original muscle that was stretched. So now if you have a muscle that's stretched, so this is your motor nerve, a motor neuron. And in this particular sense, this is called the alpha motor neurons, but you guys don't really have to know that, right? So if this is a motor neuron that is now projecting back to this particular muscle, imagine if the muscle is stretched, what do you want to do with it? Do you want to enhance that stretch, or do you want to counteract that stretch? 50-50. Pick one. Or do nothing. Okay, 33.33%. I don't know. So how many of you guys want to counteract that stretch? All reflexes is going to counter whatever the original stimulus is. Okay? It's a protective mechanism. This is to maintain homeostasis. And in homeostasis, the main thing is that negative feedback mechanism all the time. So if you're stretching the muscle, then you want to counter that stretch. Otherwise, because the body in this particular reflex is thinking, well, you stretch the muscle, you're gonna tear the muscle. So let's bring it back to normal, right? How would you bring it back to normal? You contract it. So therefore, through this motor neuron releasing neurotransmitter, you're gonna stimulate contraction of this muscle. Okay? Now, when you contract this muscle, what's going to happen to your lower leg? It's going to extend outward. Okay? when you have movement of a joint, what do you need to have in terms of muscle activities? Remember, across that joint, you have opposing muscle groups. There's a primary muscle group, and there's the antagonistic muscle group. So if you want to contract this muscle to extend this joint, what you need to do to the opposing muscle group? You need to cause the relaxation. Okay, and we'll talk about that in a second. Now, if you just look at this reflex arch, this is your monosynaptic reflex. There's one synapse happening between the sensory nerve and the motor nerve directly. Okay? So because of that, it's an instant type of reflex mechanism where as soon as you strike that patellar tendon, you're gonna have a reflex initiated. All right, now, in order for this lower leg to basically extend outward, not only do you need to contract this muscle, you also need to relax the opposing muscle. So imagine you have an opposing muscle over here, we'll call it the hamstring muscle. Right? This is the opposing muscle, that's the quadricep muscle, that's the hamstring muscle, right? Opposite, it's on opposite side of that joint. Now, in order for that opposing muscle, that antagonistic muscle group to relax, you need to also inhibit it or stimulate it, whatever you guys want. So therefore, this sensory neuron, as it relays this information into the spinal cord, it also has a collateral axon. And this collateral axon is going to stimulate an interneuron. You guys remember interneurons? These are exclusive neurons found within the central nervous system itself. This interneuron is going to stimulate another motor neuron. And this other motor neuron will inhibit the opposing muscle group. Okay. What happens if you don't inhibit this muscle group? If you still maintain the contraction of that muscle group? What's going to happen to this joint? No movement. That's exactly what happened with you. Because she's still contracting her hamstring muscle to a certain extent. And that's why there is no movement of that patellar tendon. Right? Maybe because the way she's sitting, she's compressing on it, so therefore always maintaining tension on that muscle itself. So that's why when you guys are doing this particular reflex, or any reflexes of the body, you gotta make sure the patient is in a position where they don't have any tension applied to any of this muscle group that you're testing. Otherwise, you're not gonna get the reaction that you want. And then you're gonna continue to just like slap the hell out of that tendon for no apparent reason, right? I mean, the hitting is not supposed to be that hard. You're not supposed to cause like bruising in the patient, especially if it's a rubber mallet. If you do cause bruising in a patient using a rubber mallet, you are doing a little bit too much. So you just gotta keep that in mind. All right, now, this original pathway where you strike the patellar tendon causing a stretch, the sensory neuron relays this information, synapsing directly onto the motor neuron. This blue motor neuron goes back to the same muscle group to induce contraction and therefore opposes that stretch. That is the monosynaptic reflex. The other pathway that is sent by this sensory neuron to an interneuron to stimulate that red motor neuron to inhibit the opposing muscle group, that is known as the reciprocal innervation. Okay? So for this pathway here, this is known as the reciprocal innervation. We'll call it that. Just so you know, that's a secondary pathway. So when I ask you guys, if I'm asking you guys to draw out just the monosynaptic reflex, the only thing you need to draw out is the primary pathway. If I ask you guys to draw out the reciprocal innervation, you must draw both. You cannot have reciprocal innervation without that primary pathway. Make sense? Because what stimulates the reciprocal innervation it has to be the primary pathway that will also stimulate that reciprocal innervation. Because not all reflexes require some kind of movement of your joint. You can actually have muscle contraction without joint movement, because you can actually strike the brachioradialis muscle or the tendons of that muscle and get that muscle to contract without really moving your arm or your wrist or whatever the case is, right? You can feel that muscle twitching, and that's the reflex. That's all you need. So therefore, you can actually have the reflex without the reciprocal innervation. The only time the reciprocal innervation kicks in is when you have to actually move that joint. And that's when the reciprocal innervation is more important. Okay? So that is called the monosynaptic reflex with the reciprocal innervation in that sense. Now, on the other sense, here you have, let's say, your muscle group. This is the bicep muscle in a contracted state. So when the bicep muscle is in a contracted state, you are basically applying what we call tension to the muscle. Okay? So you're in a constant contracted state, you're applying tension. When you're applying tension to the muscle, where is the tension felt the most along this muscle group? In the middle or toward the tendons? Imagine you're pulling on a rope. If you take the rope and let's say the rope is tethered to either side, right? And you're standing in the middle and you take that rope and you pull the rope together. You think the tension is right in the center, or is it at the end? So anytime you have muscle contraction, the highest tension is at the tendons. Okay? So therefore, the Golgi tendon organ detects this. That's what it's supposed to do. So as the Golgi tendon organ detects this, it will relay this information again through a sensory neuron. The sensory neuron enters the spinal cord and will immediately synapse with an interneuron. That interneuron projects to the ventral gray horn, and will synapse with a motor neuron. This motor neuron, part of that reflex, goes back to the original muscle. What do you think the effect would be? What's the result of this reflex? Yeah, because you have tension, so therefore as you apply tension, there's more and more tension right at the tendons. So the body's thinking, well, if you continue to apply this tension, you're gonna damage that tendon, rip the tendon, rip the bone, rip the periosteum, whatever the case is, right? Now, the attachment of the tendon to that periosteum is very strong. Please understand that. You easily rip the muscle before you break that tendon. And sometimes, depends on the attachment, you will actually break the bones before you separate the tendon from the periosteum. Okay, so it all depends, especially around your ankle area. Okay, so in this particular case, you will induce relaxation of the muscle. So imagine if you're holding something really heavy and you're like, oh, this is getting too much. You just kind of relax. That's a reflexive response. Okay? Now, can you have a reciprocal innervation for this particular reaction? Absolutely. You need to move this joint, you better have a reciprocal innervation. If you don't, that joint's not gonna move. So we call this a polysynaptic reflex. Because there's two synapses that occurs. One is between the sensory neuron and the interneuron, and the second one is between the interneuron and a motor neuron. Hence, it's more than one. That's what we call it, polysynaptic. Okay. And of course, if you want to draw in, if there's some kind of reciprocal innervation, make sure you guys kind of place in this collateral axon, synapsing onto another interneuron, and the interneuron will project to the ventral gray horn, which then synapse onto another motor neuron. This motor neuron is going to go to whatever this opposing muscle group is, which in this case is going to be your tricep muscle, right? So the bicep muscle is in the front, the tricep muscle is in the back. Essentially, just kind of think of it that way. And then what's it gonna do here? Since you have relaxation of that primary muscle group, you're gonna have contraction of your antagonist muscle. So when you contract the tricep, you will extend your elbow joint. So if you're contracting and all of a sudden you can't handle that weight, you're gonna let go. If you let go and you change the shape of your joint, this is also due to the fact that you have a reciprocal innervation stimulating the opposing muscle. Okay? So, quite easy to understand, hopefully. Good. Please know all these for your lab exam. Special senses, all special senses. Okay? Gustation, olfaction, vestibular, auditory, visual. Special senses. Sensory deficit, very important for you guys to know. What happens when you have deafness? What happens when you have visual deficiency? Like the visual deficits that we talked about, right? All those, anyway, visual fields and retinal fields and all that, fibers getting cut left and right, whatever the case is, okay? All the videos that we watch in sleep, make sure when you guys have all those questions answered and stuff like that, that's basically gonna be somewhat what I'm gonna be asking you guys, right? So sleep and secrets of the mind video about, that phantom limb and that top grass, condition and stuff like that. Brain waves are very important: alpha, beta, theta, delta. That's all you need to know. There's only 4 brain waves. Okay? You want to know what those brain waves look like? Look in your lab and look at the brain waves. I know we didn't do the brain wave activities. That's okay. There's a picture of it. It's gonna be the same picture. I'm gonna give you that one. It's gonna be the same picture I'm gonna give you on the lab exam. So if you don't know what those brain waves look like, you're screwed. And please don't just memorize it, alpha, beta, delta, theta. I'm gonna mix them up. Okay? So just don't memorize it the way it's like in the order that it is. Now, of course, you have to know what's prevalent in alpha wave. When do you see alpha waves? When do you see beta waves? When do you see theta waves? And when do you see delta waves? And then when you see those, are these people asleep or are they awake? Are these people adults or are they babies? That's important also. Okay, so please understand that. And when you sleep, depends on what stage of sleep you're engaged in, what kind of memory is consolidated during that sleep. So REM versus non-REM sleep, which memory is being consolidated best during REM sleep versus non-REM sleep. And in non-REM sleep, it's only stage 3 where you have consolidation of declarative memory. In REM sleep, there's only one stage of REM sleep. That's when you have consolidation of non-declarative memory. Okay? And during, let's say, stage 3 of non-REM sleep, what do your brainwaves activities look like? During REM sleep, what do the brainwave activities look like? So make sure you guys understand that. You guys know that the questions are never black and white. It's never 1 and 1. It's always 1, 2, 3, and then whatever the answer is supposed to be, right? So this is what we call a 3-step question. So you gotta understand the concept in order to recognize the details so that you can answer the question. Okay, so for the most part, you guys already know what's going on because you guys already been exposed to it at least one time. Let's see what else. Action potential is pretty easy. Know the phases of the action potential. Resting membrane potential, what are the factors that regulate the resting membrane potential? Graded potential, what gives rise to the graded potential? Depolarization, what is responsible for depolarization? What happens at the peak? What is responsible for repolarization? What's responsible for the after hyperpolarization? What's responsible and what is the main function or purpose of the absolute refractory period versus the relative refractory period? So that's basically the nervous system. And then skeletal muscle physiology, just everything we just talked about. Or maybe not everything. More or less the sliding filament theory. how do you achieve cross bridges and power stroke to allow for muscle to contract and relax? So again, sliding filament theory, the sarcomere, the excitation contraction coupling mechanism, right? And in the sliding filament theory, again, how do you achieve cross bridges? How do you achieve power strokes? That's it. It's 100 points. Keep in mind the next exam is